Pokemon is a super complex game, and if you don't believe me, try explaining EVs and IVs to a new player who's never touched competitive, try memorizing the type chart, or try explaining the damage formula and all of its quirks. Look at all this and tell me that this is a kid's game. If you follow any competitive players on Twitter, you've no doubt seen Dub Wobblefett's mechanics quizzes, and be honest with yourself, you know you've gotten the answer wrong before. For example, look at this one. If you use Foul Play into an unaware Dondozo with +2 attack and +2 defense, how was Foul Play's damage calculated? There's 4 different options here, and in my head, I can justify all 4 of them. But it's this one, and as you can see, only 1/4 of the player base, and keep in mind, these are competitive players if you're following Wobblefett, only 1/4 of competitive players got this right, which is just crazy. This game is so complicated. But as complex of a game as Pokemon is, it usually does a really good job of being digestible for its primary audience, kids. It's really easy to tell which attack is stronger, Ember or Flamethrower, based on the animations, based on the numbers that it tells you in-game. It's pretty easy to understand. And similar designs are also communicated through the design and the according stats of the Pokemon themselves. Will the Sword Dog or the Shield Dog have the higher attack? It's pretty obvious, just looking at them and then looking at the stats. The bigger number is better. Easy. The same thing applies with speed. Will the spiky yellow cat be faster, or will the little mermaid cat be faster? Again, it's pretty obvious. But there's one area of the game that's deceptively hard to get a good grasp on, and for how important it is, it's kind of weird that this is implemented in the game in the way that it is. The bulkiness of a Pokemon should be pretty simple to understand, right? There's 2 stats right there, defense and special defense. But if that's all there were, this video wouldn't exist. The bulk of a given Pokemon is complicated for the sole fact that they all have unique HP stats. For example, let's take a look at Shuckle, the king of min-maxing. Your first impression would be that this thing is simply unkillable. Look at these defenses, 230 on each side, that's insane! Nothing even comes close to those numbers. But how would you feel if I told you that it takes hits just about as well as a silly little pink guy with less than half of those numbers? Does having 230 defense matter if you could be just as well off with 120 of those points going into a different stat? Slowbro only has 75 more HP than Shuckle. That's a ton of wasted stats. Man, poor Shuckle. Okay, so we looked at Shuckle. Clearly HP matters more, right? So then if we look at Blissey, that's gotta be the bulkiest Pokemon ever, right? Well, as you may have guessed by the way I set that up, that's not that simple. Blissey takes physical hits worse than Mareanie, a first stage Pokemon where its total base stats sum up to just a little bit more than Blissey's HP. Sometimes more HP is better, sometimes it's not. How on earth are you ever supposed to get a good idea of how bulky a Pokemon actually is? And for a lot of us, you just get used to it by playing the game for years and years, but there's gotta be a better way than just intuition. Thankfully, there is. The PoppinCalculator is something that I built for planning and analyzing in Pokemon Draft League, which is the best Pokemon format, but it can be more widely applied to pretty much anything related to competitive Pokemon. And this video is going to shed a little light on how it works and how you can use it. The bulk of a Pokemon is determined by 2 things, their base defense and their base HP stat. And those 2 values work together to increase your bulk by coming at the damage problem from 2 different sides of the equation. Think of your bulk as a fraction, where the incoming damage is being represented by the numerator and your HP as the denominator. To maximize a Pokemon's bulk, we want this fraction to be as small as possible. We can do this by both reducing the incoming damage and increasing the available pool of HP that your opponent needs to get through. If we look at this, a Pokemon's defensive stats only impact the numerator, and the HP only impacts the denominator. Defensive stats help improve a Pokemon's bulk by reducing the damage coming in. And this makes sense, right? That's what you would expect that a defensive stat does. And we can see this by looking at the damage formula. While this formula might seem overwhelming at first, the only terms we need to look at are the percent damage taken and the defense stat. If you simplify the formula to be in terms of those 2 values, we can see that the percent total damage taken is inversely proportional to the given mon's defense stat. The higher your defense is, the less damage you take. The HP stat works to improve a Pokemon's bulk by increasing its maximum health. Sure, I might take 100 damage, but that's a lot less meaningful if I have 400 HP as opposed to 300. If we look at the damage formula again, we can see that the percent damage is inversely proportional to the HP stat, just like the defense stat. So to maximize bulk, we want to minimize the damage taken, while also ensuring that we have enough HP to make any given hit less meaningful. So remember, defense only affects the top, HP only affects the bottom. So let's take a look at two case studies. Shuckle and Blissey end up having the same problems. Their min-max stats do a really good job on one part of the equation, but totally fumble the ball on the other half. In Shuckle's case, it effectively minimizes the incoming damage to the smallest possible, but its HP pool is so small, those weak hits are much more meaningful. If we look at Blissey, while it might have a lot of HP to play with, those physical hits deal such insane amounts of damage, it's still at risk of getting KO'd from decently strong physical hits. But let's take a look at Slowbro, who has a much more balanced stat spread. While it takes more damage than Shuckle, it has a lot more HP to make those hits less meaningful. And while it has much less HP than Blissey, it takes a lot less damage than Blissey does, which results in taking less percent damage per hit, which is what matters. So, we see here, if we're looking at physical hits, Blissey is far worse than Shuckle, who is a little bit worse than Slowbro. This ultimately stems from the definition of inverse proportionality. As you increase one stat higher and higher, you end up getting reduced rewards. Having more HP and more defense matters to a point, after which it gets better to invest in the other. Okay, so we know you can't go crazy in one stat and neglect all your others, but that doesn't really tell us much. Beyond these edge cases, how do we know which Pokemon are the bulkiest? If the HP stat wasn't part of the mix, this wouldn't even be a question. Okay, so let's just get rid of the HP stat. The HP stat's only real function in the game is just to serve as that denominator in this damage formula. But if you play competitive mons at all, you'll never hear people talking about damage in raw numbers, you always hear them talking about percents. So if we were to make a system where all Pokemon have the same base HP, we could be able to more directly compare bulk on a one-to-one system. And that's exactly what the PoppinCalculator does. It effectively removes the HP stats and shows the user what the effective actual bulk of the Pokemon are on the physical and special sides of the spectrum. And with this, you can actually compare the physical and special bulk of Pokemon one-to-one, no nebulous HP stat messing up any analysis. So how does this work? It's pretty simple. The PoppinCalculator sets all Pokemon to a flat 80 base HP, scales their defenses accordingly so that the percent damage they take is the same as they currently do, and then you look at the new defense stats that are popped out of the equation. So let's use Avalugg as an example. Currently, Avalugg has a meaty 95 HP and 184 defense. We're going to use this equation at the top as our reference. A max attack, Jolly Quackaball close combat against a no bulk Avalugg. You can see here it does a maximum of 81% and it's a guaranteed 2-shot. So starting the calculation, we're going to set Avalugg to having a base 80 HP. So if we run this calc again, we see that Avalugg, it's still a 2-shot, but the maximum damage goes up to 89%, which isn't quite accurate. So what we do is we take the percent damage from the first hit, 81.1, put that back into the damage formula on the damage percent side. We plug in Avalugg's new max HP, which we know from being base 80 with no investment is 155, and we know Quackaball's attack at 252 Jolly is 172, and we know Close Combat's base power is 120. We plug those all into the formula, and then we solve for defense. Our defense stat comes out as being 277. That's more than a regular Avalugg can get by investing, even going max defense bold. So we have to back calculate what its new base defense stat would be in order to hit 277. So we go to the defense formula, we plug in 0 EVs, 0 IVs, put Avalugg to level 50, get rid of the boosting nature, and we can see that Avalugg would need to have a new effective defense stat of 207. So let's double check. We put the same calc back into the damage formula, a max attack Jolly Quackaball with close combat into an Avalugg if it were to have 80 base HP and 207 defense, and we get the same range. We have a maximum damage percent of 81.2, which is pretty damn close to 81.1. Due to the way that Pokemon rounds it isn't going to be exact, otherwise we'd have fractional defenses which the game doesn't support. So this is the most realistic way we can model this. If we run the PoppinCalculator on its defense and special defense, we can see that Avalugg has an effective defense of 207 and an effective special defense of 57. It is so much easier to look at this way. What the PoppinCalculator ends up doing is scaling up the defenses of mons with a base HP that's higher than 80, and if your base HP is lower than 80, your stats are going to go down. The reason I chose 80 is because that's the average HP stat of all fully evolved Pokemon within Scarlet and Violet. Okay, so we have the PoppinCalculator working. However, there are a couple edge cases that I wanted to account for when building this tool. A lot of NFE Pokemon are used because they can hold the Eviolite. So obviously the Eviolite multiplies your defenses by 50%, so we want to be able to account for that within the PoppinCalculator. So essentially what we do is we go through the same process again in the damage formula. So we go through the damage formula. In the percent damage formula, we want to calculate our new defense based on the damage we take holding a Eviolite. We get the defense value of whatever it is. We back calculate it through the base defense calculator, and we can see that for Shelgon, its effective defense is 141, which is significantly higher than it would be if it was not holding an Eviolite. So the PoppinCalculator works to help you properly analyze your NFE picks if you're going for value on like a draft board or maybe playing in a lower tier. It helps you better figure out how bulky these Pokemon actually are going to be in practice. But hey, let's try it one more time. Maybe we don't want to look at how bulky a Mon can be with no EVs or IVs. Let's see how bulky a Mon can be when it's fully maxed out. And the way we do that is just changing the stats in the initial damage calculator. Once we get our percentile, we rerun everything back through the damage formulas in reverse, and we get our effective defense values, which are going to be significantly higher than they would be with no bulk. And as we get these numbers higher and higher, the rounding errors get a little bit more extreme. This time we're not playing with 0.1%, we're playing with almost 2%, actually a little over 2%. So it's still roughly accurate, and it's going to be the best way to rank these Mons, but don't use these as gospel, right? Don't try to do your calcs based off effective defense, because that'll just be a nightmare. Now, if we want to look at these stats after accounting for max HP and max defense and special defense, we see Torkoal's effective defense shoots up to 235, an incredible number, and its effective special defense goes up all the way to 141, which is pretty good. Okay, cool. So we can account for a Eviolite, we can account for EVs and IVs and maxing out your stats, but as you know, not all types are created equally. An Ice and Rock type is going to take way more damage on average than the Fire Steel type. The calculations I've done up to this point are all done using a typeless move, but in reality, that's never what happens. The last thing the PoppinCalculator can do is use a toggle feature to turn on or turn off average type effectiveness. And take this with an even bigger grain of salt, because there's no perfect way to implement this. This very last tab over here, the type effectiveness tab, adds a type correction factor into the reverse damage formula. What this effectively does is increase the incoming damage for quote bad defensive types and reduce it for quote good ones. So this leads to those types having lower and higher effective defenses respectively. But what makes a type good or bad? I mean, there's obvious answers. Rock is pretty bad defensively, Steel is good, but again, that's all relative. If you're in a meta overflowing with fire types, Steel starts to look pretty bad and Rock starts to look amazing. So the way that this calculator defines goodness and badness takes the composition of the format into account. All the Pokemon in the calculator have their types summed up to determine the type composition of the meta. Each offensive type will have a frequency factor applied to them based on this data. To score a Pokemon's defensive type goodness, you multiply the type's matchup chart by the frequency factors of all the offensive types and sum them up. For example, if a Pokemon were to have no weaknesses and no resistances, it would have a defensive score of 1, meaning that it always takes the full damage, no increases, no decreases of incoming stab attacks. So, let's take a look at some examples. Starting off easy, we have Normal. With Normal, it only has 2 interactions. It takes double damage from fighting types and none from ghost types. In the Regulation C format, which is where these examples are from, there are exactly as many fighting types as there are ghost types. So, when you multiply this through, you end up with 1 again. Looking at the Regulation C format, we can see that the worst Pokemon, type-wise, is unfortunately Pupitar, all alone with the ground and rock typing, severely hampered by the frequency of water and grasses in the format, and kind of unsurprisingly, we can see Zacian up here. The Fairy Steel type is the best type, again, in Regulation C. Regulation D2, they didn't really change much with the additions, with a average multiplier of 0.73% of the incoming damage, whereas Pupitar is going to be taking 42% damage on average from any given move just due to its abundance of weaknesses. Okay, so considering all those factors, let's take a look at just some of the extremes of what we've got. Let's look at the most bulky physical Mons possible. If we want to turn on a Eviolite, max out our HP and defense, and type effectiveness, we see that Corviknight and Bisharp are tied for number 1 in terms of effective defense. This is due mainly to their incredible defensive typings, good HP and defense stats combined, and in Bisharp's case, the Eviolite. If we want to look at special defense, we have Chansey, who is far and away, insanely, not even close, the best specially Pokemon with a neutral type modifier, as we saw earlier, and just an astounding 824 effective special defense thanks to the Eviolite. And surprisingly, Tinglu comes in next when you factor in for type effectiveness, because Dark and Ground is actually a pretty decent defensive type. Funny enough, Tinglu is actually equally bulky on both sides of the spectrum when you account for this, and account for Vessel of Ruin. So, that's the PoppinCalculator. When I look at a Pokemon to pick up for a team, I try not to look only at effective defense or effective special defense. I like to look at their overall bulk, which I calculate as the Poppin rating. What this is it takes the defense times the special defense and takes the square root of that value. What this effectively does is punish mons who are only bulky on one side of the spectrum. So if you look at Chansey, who has an effective defense of 220 and an effective SPDEF of 824, if you add those two values together, you get over 1,000. But the fact that it's weighted so heavily in special defense, when you do the average this way, it only has a rating of 425, whereas Tinglu has equal defenses on both sides, and while having 400 less effective defense base stat total, it still has a Poppin rating only 100 less than Chansey, which is pretty crazy. So that's the PoppinCalculator, a very useful tool that I use in almost every draft I'm in to determine the bulk of mons in the format, and try to figure out what might be flying under the radar in terms of its overall bulk. So that's the video. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I have linked the PoppinCalculator in the description. Have this updated for Regulation D, so more accurate to the current format, and go ahead and use it, try it out, see what you like, and if you have any suggestions or issues, leave in the comments and let me know. This is a work in progress, and I'm constantly trying to find ways to make this better. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Later.